Hi, my name is Jeff Pagano, and welcome to First Person Plural, a blog covering Irish and American politics with a progressive slant. Well, this week I want to talk about Palestine. Uh, small, not too much to that topic, is there? But before I do, just to set the scene, I want to talk a little about Trump a bit. I'm sorry, but it's relevant to what I want to say. Trump currently is still going on about this big lie I've spoken about before. He's trying to claim that the election was stolen from him. There's this thing going on in Arizona where they're looking back at the ballots again. He claimed last week that there was evidence that a database had been deleted, made a big stink about that. Turns out they had the database all along. They had to admit it, so it's a joke. But anyway, the question is, and I touched on this the last time, is why is he doing it? What's the reason he's doing it? Because obviously he's got to know that he's not actually going to turn over the election. So why is he doing it? Well, the reason is very simple. Because he's not on Twitter anymore, he set up his own blog from the desk of Donald Trump, where he basically just regurgitates his tweets. He does his tweets every day now. And if you want, you can share them, but it's basically somewhere you can go to see all his latest statements, and the statements read like his tweets used to. But right beside the most latest tweet is a contribute button, and he wants you to contribute to his it's to his campaign for re-election. But the reality is he has a court case in Georgia. He's got a court case in the state of New York, and he's got a court case in Manhattan, which was a civil case over his businesses, which recently, I think just yesterday, got upgraded to a criminal case. So he's got all that going on. He's got lawyers up the yin yang. He's got legal fees to pay, and that's essentially what this is for. So that's why he's doing it. So the more he talks about from his supporters about how the election was stolen from him, the more money he makes. It's really that simple. I mean, you apply the logic: walks like a duck, talks like a duck, quacks like a duck, all that. It's just money, raising money. It's all he's ever been about is money. But the reality in this case, he's just continuing this big lie. I personally don't think he's actually has any plans of being reelected. He's thinking about his legal battles ahead. He needs money for that, and he's strapped for cash in reality, despite the fact that his persona is that he's supposed to be this billionaire, but the reality is he needs the dough. He's lying. He's conning these supporters out of their money to fund his legal fees, and that's why he's doing it. So that's why that. Now, put that aside for a second and remember that before I get into this wider topic about Palestine. Now, first, the question needs to be asked. I was born in America. I grew up in Ireland. I am neither Jewish nor Arab. No connections to either community in any way, really. And so the question could be asked, do I have a right to have an opinion on what's happening in the Middle East? I've never lived there. I've never set foot on the soil in the Middle East. I've never been anywhere near that part of the world. Do I have a right to express an opinion? Well, obviously I do, because you see on the news stories of children being killed, civilians being killed, just basic buildings and communities and death and all this stuff. This is stuff you want to hear about. You want to understand why it's going on. But I suppose on the question is, do I have a right to an opinion? Should I just say, well, I know nothing about it. I'm not from there. My opinion on having an opinion is that, especially in these hotspots around the world, I think an opinion from outside the bubble, as it were, is crucial. It's vital to understand what's going on, because I've always believed that there's a hell of a lot more similarities between all these conflict situations than we make out. There's people that are there on the ground that says, oh no, you don't have a right to say anything. You don't understand, like this guy did this to him and those people did that to them. And this goes back hundreds of years. You got to get the context going back, all the same. I mean, to me, the similarities far outweigh the differences. The names might be different, the people, the actions, the timeline, the sequence of events might be sort of different, but for example, you look at some of the big hotspot areas in recent history. Okay, you do have the Middle East, but you also had South Africa with its apartheid regime. You have Northern Ireland. You still do have Northern Ireland. What's going on up there? There's three very different situations. Of course, apart from the British being involved in each case, obviously that's an obvious thing they have in common, but I don't just mean that. Take the labels off, take the countries off, take all that off. What is going on? You have, in each of those cases, Northern Ireland, South Africa apartheid, and the Middle East, you have an area where there's a majority, supposedly, there's one group of people suppressing another. Okay, in South Africa, it was not a majority. I know that, but in Northern Ireland, it wasn't. There was a sort of a majority within Northern Ireland. But the point is, on a wider scale, they are not a majority. Like on the island of Ireland, for example, the Catholics outnumbered the Protestants, and in the wider region of the Middle East, the Arabs far outnumber the Jews, and that was the whole point there. So there's similarities between them all, and that oppressive minority / majority I'm talking about, they required backing from outside, from foreign backing behind them. In the case of Northern Ireland, the Unionists had the British government. In the case of South Africa, the South African, there was a lot of gold and diamonds down there. There was a lot of industry that was down there. It was like basically the world was letting them continue the way they were because they were doing business with them. It was the wider global community that was just as guilty of that, as far as I'm concerned. And then, of course, in the Middle East, it's basically America. I mean, there is support from elsewhere, but the Israel government has, the Israel state has always relied heavily on lobbying and getting support, directly support from the U.S. government. Both parties, actually, probably the Democrats more than the Republicans, but both parties, whichever is in power, has tended to support the Israeli government no matter what, and that's the backing they have. Whereas the Palestinians are a small minority within themselves, but when you've got the wider Arab peoples from countries all around, the Israelis are totally outnumbered. So there's a lot more similarities. That's the point I'm trying to make. And I think just because we don't know the actual finicky bits of the history doesn't mean we're not allowed to be involved, doesn't mean we're allowed to offer opinions. And I think sometimes those opinions from outside the bubble can be just as influential, because if the causation of these tensions have similarities throughout the world, then surely the possible solutions. I mean, look at South Africa now. Obviously, they have their problems now, but the apartheid regime is gone. You look in Northern Ireland, obviously they still have their problems now, but you still have the Good Friday Agreement. That was a major, major breakthrough that happened. And the de-escalation over the years, the dramatic de-escalation of the troubles in the North since that agreement has been down to it, and the work that went into it. So now you look just to mention Trump for a second now, you look at what's happening in Israel, he would say, oh, well, I've got my, the Abraham Accords is the reason why I've, he thought he deserved a Nobel Peace Prize for these Abraham Accords, which are essentially, in my view anyway, a business deal between Israel and other Arab nations that really were Bahrain and UAE, and it was just a business deal between Israel and those countries. And just because they're Arab countries doesn't mean you're solving the Middle East, because you're not involving Palestine, simply put. So that's what's going on there. So what my overall point is, I believe I have a right to an opinion because I've even studied a little bit about history. I think people need to know the context within the country and the history. If they need to educate themselves more, but we're still entitled to have an opinion. Right. Okay. So what's going on there right now? Obviously, it's been in the news for the past week or so, a couple of weeks, right? There's a lot of rockets being fired. There's a lot of buildings being destroyed. There's a lot of death, destruction, and it doesn't seem to be an end. Well, what actually triggered it is there's a region, there's a building complex within the city of Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah. There's a conflict over the occupancy of that complex going way back to the 50s and beyond. But the basis is that a number of Palestinian families were living there, but gradually over the years that the Israel government has tried to get them out, basically done every legal manipulation they can to get them out. They believe that the Israeli state has always tried to say they should leave. They wouldn't leave. It's been a lot of tensions there, and then recently the courts have determined that they should leave, and so obviously that's going to fuel tensions. I mean, with all else that's going on, the blockade on Gaza, the occupation of territories that were supposed to be Palestine, the fact that the Palestinian people are just basically prisoners where they are, it's going to lead to terrorism. I don't approve of terrorism. I never approved of the IRA, never approved of what was going on in South Africa, the terrorist incidents and stuff. But sometimes you just, when the pushing and the pushing and pushing gets so much, they're gonna fight back. And that eviction, the imminent eviction from that Sheikh Jarrah complex, on top of the Israeli army sending troops to a mosque in the middle of Ramadan. They sent the troops in their very aggressive posture. At first, they weren't being violent, but their presence there would have been an offense during prayer time. Would have been an offense to the Arab people, to the Palestinian people, and they would those two incidents in Jerusalem combined to set off what we have now. And eventually, Hamas, they'd be the most extremist group, I'd say, there when it comes to terrorism. And the only recourse they have is firing rockets. I don't approve of firing rockets, but they believe that's all they can do. So they started firing rockets at Israel, and I'll come back to the rockets in a minute. So that's what started it. And then when the rockets start coming, obviously the Israelis return in kind, and they start firing into bombs into Gaza and other what they call military targets, places they say they know that Hamas are centered, and they claim, and because they claim that Hamas are using people and hospitals and news networks as human shields, they're not. They say that they tell them to leave. They give them a warning. Oh, isn't that nice of them? They give them a few hours warning that they're going to bomb the bejesus out of the place, and they send in the rockets and they destroy it. So that's what's happened. That's what's happening. It's been back and forth and back and forth. Now, this is why I mentioned Trump at the start. Now, the question is that all there is to it? Is it just this historical, it was always going to be something that's going to spark the tensions between the Israel? Well, there's an extra element to this, and that is Benjamin Netanyahu, who is still the prime minister, even though they've had 4 elections in 2 years in that country, and they can't decide on a government. It's a complicated, there's only 120 seats in the Knesset in Israel, and you need 61 for a majority, and there's about 15 different parties, some of them left-wing, some of them right-wing, some of them business, some of them unions. Most of them are Jewish, but there are some Arab parties as well. There are Palestinian citizens. They do have their Arab parties. And this was the 4th election. Netanyahu's party won 30 seats, but they need 61. So they've had to cobble together a coalition to form a government. They hadn't been able to. The opposition, and this is the point, the opposition was very close to forming a government, and that government would have included some of those Arab parties, right? So that would be considered maybe unacceptable to some of the more hardline Israeli parties there. So there was that, but there's also the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu himself is he's under investigation. He's been charged. It was back in 2019 when this came out. He was officially charged with deception and breach of trust and actual receiving bribes. He's to go on trial for that. And of course, when he's prime minister, he can't go on trial. So that's real convenient. So those 2 reasons, if that's not a reason to stoke tensions and to enforce this eviction in the complex in Jerusalem and to send troops, a real provocative in the middle of Ramadan, send troops into a mosque while Palestinians are praying. If that's not a motivation to do that, which will mean to inflame, to provoke Hamas into firing rockets, that's going to do that, right? It's obviously the simplest answer. Now, in fairness, there was I'm going to get now to the media coverage of this, and there was an interview on, I think it was ABC, or no, CBS, had Benjamin Netanyahu himself on as an interview on Sunday, and they asked him, he gave all the usual spiel, oh, they're firing rockets, we have a right to defend ourselves, all these usual sound bites you hear from Israeli government officials. But, and I was sitting there going, he's not asking him about the government. He's not asking him about the formation of a government. He's not asking him about the fact that he's been charged. This is typical media. They're accepting just unconditional acceptance of what the Israeli government says. But right at the end, he did ask a question. Fair play to the guy. He did ask him. He asked him, there are some who say that you are trying to cover up for the fact that you yourself are under investigation. You're trying to cover up for yourself that there's going to be an alternative government, that you're going to, if you're no longer prime minister, that you're going to be, your investigation is going to go forward and you'll be criminally charged and you could actually face prison. And all he had to say was, well, this is preposterous. That's all he had to say. I mean, he said more words, but that's basic. Oh, it's preposterous. Of course, that's a lie. And it's like, well, that's not good enough. You know what I mean? It's the simplest answer is the obvious. And that is why all this is going on. I think he's the factor. And my general point about the media coverage, I meant to talk more about that, but that basically is the basis of it. It's getting better now. It used to be, they used to just blindly accept that any violence that was happening in the Middle East, since one side is a recognized government from Israel. I mean, it is a recognized government, but they're saying the other side are terrorists, right? They use that word terrorist to indicate not only Hamas that are firing the rockets, but also all the civilians that are killed, right? There was this sort of blanket kind of exception. There was no distinction made between the two. Meanwhile, on the other side, if you dared criticize anything the Israeli government was doing, hashtag Jeremy Corbyn, you were considered anti-Semitic. That viewpoint was brought to this extreme. You criticize Israel, you're criticizing the entire Jewish people, and that's just not true. Okay, governments anywhere can do wrong. Governments anywhere can do bad things, and in this case, we have a situation where yes, Hamas are firing rockets at Israel, but the Israel happens to have this thing called Iron Dome. Okay, and this Iron Dome is basically this amazing technology which fires rockets at the rockets, okay, automatically. So Netanyahu would go on, part of his interview, they are firing 3,000. This number is going up every day. It was 2,000, 2,500, 2,900, 3,500 rockets. That's what they'll say. That's what you'll hear the spin from the Israeli government, that they are firing 3,500 rockets. And if you didn't know, you'd assume, oh my God, 3,500 rockets raining in on the Israeli people. That's terrible. That's disgraceful. Of course they should be, but that's not what's happening. They're only firing that many rockets because they need that many to get any through, to make any point. It's the only way they can have. Now, I'm not approving of that. I'm just saying you're being disingenuous when you talk about the amount of the rockets. It's like if someone's poking you and then you punch them and you're like, oh my God, you punched me. That's what happened there. But if someone's poking you and then they put on a big metal suit of armor and then they're poking you, you've got to hit them harder to retaliate, again. And then they make a deal about, oh, look how hard he hit me. Oh, he had to hit you. You were provoking him and you had this armor. So this talk about 3,000, 4,000 rockets, it's just like, that means nothing, because going into this conflict, which I believe Netanyahu instigated for his own aims, going into this, everybody knew that no matter how many rockets you fired at Israel, most of them, the vast majority, I think it's up to 90% of them, will be intercepted, and they won't get anywhere. They'll just so maybe you should be thinking, instead of 4,000, focusing on the 4,000 rockets and letting it be perceived that they're all falling on Israeli people. Maybe there's that. It also shows just how upset the Palestinian people have been. Again, I don't approve of terrorism. I don't approve of rockets. But what you have now is a situation where there's deaths on both sides. There have been deaths on both sides, but way more on the Palestinian side. Way more. You're talking dozens on the Israeli side, and we're talking hundreds on the Palestinian side. And the proportion of, they say they're military targets, it's mostly civilians that are being killed. Okay, and if you blow up a building and you ring them 2 hours ahead and say you're going to blow up a building, that doesn't mean there aren't going to be casualties, because you don't know. You might have control over. They say that they can pinpoint with a rocket. They can pinpoint a room in a building and just hit that room. They say they can do that, and I'm very happy for them. But you can never fully control how this is going to turn out, what kind of fallout is going to be. And to use words like collateral damage or it's unfortunate and we don't want to do this and blah, 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 it means nothing. So we need to, from Ireland's standpoint, Simon Coveney has come out. So Ireland's in an interesting position here. They're on the Security Council for 2 years, and the UN tends to do nothing. It's the U.S. is the responsibility for this conflict. The UN just basically puts out statements. But Coveney, I have to say, now maybe he's seeing he might be Taoiseach in a couple of years. I don't know, but he's come out with some good, strong statements against what the Israeli government is doing. Some realistic statements. Obviously, you can't condone Hamas as a terrorist organization, but you just got to get the weighting, the balance of it right, and realize that you can't just cover it by saying Israel has the right to defend itself, because in this particular situation, they weren't defending themselves. They claim, they talk about the first rockets Hamas was firing as if they just did it totally unprovoked. Again, I don't approve of the rockets, but you've got the Sheikh Jarrah complex. You've got the putting Israeli troops in the mosque as they were praying. You've got all that going on. All I'm saying is, like, don't talk about this and don't listen to what the media is saying without appreciating what is actually happening. Look for good sources online. There are good sources. I believe now, I don't always like what the Young Turks have to say, but if you look at what Cenk has been saying about this particular situation, he's had some really good rants. I don't always agree with him. I don't just accept what they say verbatim, but his particular contributions on his show have been really good. And he's been angry about the media coverage, but he's been fair. Like me, he's pointing out that there's media, that the mainstream media has been a lot more honest about what's going on. And it is getting better, but hopefully we'll get to a stage where the public perception is more correct, and we're not getting this biased Israel government backed by America spin over what's happening out there, so that maybe the world can actually help the situation better and come to a better solution for both sides. For the Palestinian people in particular, though, who have no home, they're fenced in, they've got nothing to do, and if they can be brought to a situation where they can have what they can call a home without having to resort to terrorism, or at least stay quiet while the terrorists do their speaking for them. So that's all. I've gone on way longer than I thought. I don't even have a timer on, so I don't know how long this is. I'm going to wrap it up there. Check out the blog, First Person Plural. It's on furperplu.com. And I'm going to be on Twitter as well soon, and the YouTube channel and all that kind of stuff. Subscribe, do all that kind of stuff. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Jeff Pagano. I am nothing. We are everything.